Thank you all for being here on this, I believe it's Wednesday today, evening. And I want to thank the Center for Africana Studies for the invitation, as well as all the faculty. And I also want to thank Gail, who has been so incredibly amazing and helpful in organizing. This is my first in-person event since the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm not wearing a mask only because I gotta talk in the mic, but so I'm not trying to live dangerously. I'm just, trying to be clear. So thank you. So I was incredibly nervous, but I'm so happy to be here. And I want to thank all the staff in Africana Studies. They really do the work that propel anything that is possible for us to do as faculty and as teachers. So with that, I am going to start this presentation, Intimacies to Apocalypso. So if you know the book, you know that the opening chapter is after the introduction is Intimacies, and the closing chapter before the conclusion is Apocalypso. So it's basically going to be an overview of how I approach the book and what's going on, and some of the key figures and thinkers, as well as frameworks that help me come to this project. I usually like to start my presentations with a little bit about me. Oftentimes, I know that as scholars, we are taught that objectivity is key, right? Like, we cannot be present in our work. And for me, while this particular project is not about specifically the Afro-Puerto Rican experience, the next one is, I find that the kinds of lived experiences that we have in the ethics in our growing up in our families really shape the kinds of questions that we ask and the people and the things that we think are important, the people and knowledges. And so this is the mountains of Caguas, where my mother is from Puerto Rico, my father's from the coastal area of Vega Baja. And this is where I grew up, mostly in Hoboken, New Jersey, in the tenements up here uptown. And when those burned, then we moved to the projects. And it's right across from Lower Manhattan, kind of close to here, I guess. And my parents, both in Puerto Rico, my father studied up to the 3rd grade, and my mother was able to study to the 8th grade. And I choose these photos without really thinking about it, but later on I realized how important they are, because this is me and my father at my 1st grade graduation. And this is me and my mother, my PhD graduation. Years later, my father had passed away, so he wasn't there. But I think about these photos, and I think about the way that even though they didn't have a formal education, the kind of education that was afforded to me, how much I learned from them, from their lived experiences, from their ethics, their ideas of solidarity and relationality, and even their philosophies of being, about who is important and who we need to listen to. And so for me, this is an important part of how I think about myself in the world as someone who's like a 1st-generation high school graduate, college graduate, et cetera, et cetera. And so I want to start today's conversation, or I guess today's talk, by thinking through and with the work of M. Jackie Alexander, and thinking about pedagogies of crossing. I often think about the ways that my work is deeply informed by the way that she urges us to consider the crossing, and also the ways that both the crossings in the book, as well as my own crossings as someone who's a Black woman, colonial subject on the settled lands of indigenous people, where legacies of enslavement are still palpable, become such an important way for us to think about who we owe and why, and where we should put our efforts in terms of thinking about solidarity. Jackie Alexander says, "This then is the existential message of the crossing, to apprehend how it might instruct us in the urgent task of configuring new ways of being and knowing, and to plot the different metaphysics that are needed to move away from living alterity premised in difference, to living intersubjectivity premised in relationality and solidarity," right? This has been so important to me. And this artwork is by Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, who's also the artist on the cover of my book, and I'll talk a little bit about that artwork later on. So Connecting Diasporas is a book that traces the long history between the Caribbean, specifically the Latinx Caribbean, specifically Black Latinx Caribbean peoples, in relationship to Equatorial Guinea, which is a small nation state in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's the only nation state that speaks Spanish, the only Spanish-speaking nation in sub-Saharan Africa, and basically tracing the kind of long legacies of colonialism, of penal colonies, of deportees, of enslaved, emancipated deportees, and then trying to move beyond the kind of ways that we think about Latinx studies and Afro-Latinidad, and beyond the ways that we think about African studies, which often leaves out Equatorial Guinea because it is kind of, quote unquote, linguistically isolated in the region, and to imagine how they can instruct us in thinking about new ways of being, new ways of knowing, and to think about decolonization in different ways. So when I'm thinking about decolonizing diasporas, I'm not thinking about the act of me as a scholar or critic decolonizing diasporas. I'm actually thinking about the ways that they are decolonizing forces themselves, right? And how we can be instructed by their works. And so in the book, I look at music, short stories, novels, images, and a series of other kind of media to kind of trace the kinds of preoccupations that emerge when you put together folks who are oftentimes peripheralized, right, in conversation with each other. And when I talk about peripheralization, I'm specifically building on the work of Dominican scholars Silvio Torres Sayan and Ramon Hernandez in their book, The Dominican Americans, where they argued, and this is in the late 90s, that if Latino studies is marginal, then Dominican studies is peripheral to that margin, right? And particularly in that time, that was very true because Dominicans were very, Dominican studies scholarship was very lacking, right? I think that has changed now because there's this huge boom in transnational Dominican studies, which is really exciting to see. But I still think that the idea of the periphery of the margin becomes an important way, an important lens for us to think about whose work matters, whose work we see, and what kinds of perspectives and point of view are often left out or put on the periphery, and what happens when we put those folks in conversation with each other? How can they tell us about kind of well-worn themes that we already know about, right? Things that we care about, such as home, belonging, justice, decolonization, right? Dictatorship, oppression of all kinds, right? How do they experience it, and what are the ways that they link together? So this is a kind of more kind of professional map, because this previous map right here is a Google map. That's the one that I did. But this is the one of my students who's very, very good at making digital maps with ArcGIS helped me do. And so here we have the islands, right? This kind of geography that we're kind of familiar with. We're familiar with Cuba, Hispaniola, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, right? These archipelagos. And I'm thinking about this kind of migration, and funnily enough, a lot of the work that I was looking at was migrations to the Northeast, you know? I was like, I have to go beyond the migrations to the Northeast, but it really just followed me to this project. But in a good way. And then I'm thinking about this as an expanse map, right? To think about this expanse and to actually think about what would it mean to us for us to link across the Atlantic to Equatorial Guinea, which is a piece of the continent in 5 islands, and their migration and exile to Spain, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but I'm going to pull up a closer map of these places. Again, this is the map that we are very familiar with, being on this kind of sphere. And this is the map of Equatorial Guinea, so we see here where it is on the continent. It is between Cameroon and Gabon. It is this kind of a slice of the continent here. Bioko, this island here, is the main seat of power for Equatorial Guinea. It's where the city of Malabo is. It used to be Fernando Po. And then we have El Obe Chico, El Obe Grande, we have Corisco, and then down here, all the way here, we have Amaron. And this becomes an important idea, an important way to think about both Equatorial Guinea as another kind of archipelagic formation, but also to think about the distance of these places. And in one of the chapters, I talk about the distance of Amaron, right, and the kinds of ways that it is so far from the seat of power up here, right, and yet still they feel so harshly, right, the effects of the dictatorship, right, and what does that mean when we pay attention to people who are so far off in the periphery, and allow them to instruct us, right, in terms of how they combat, contend with, and survive dictatorship and occupation. Another important thing to note is that the island of Bioko, the autochthonous folks from Bioko are the Bubi. However, the folks who come into power in Equatorial Guinea after colonialism, so after Francisco Franco's kind of derrota, we see that Equatorial Guinea moves from being a colony to quote-unquote a democracy, which is very short-lived. They have one dictator, Francisco Macias Nguema, who very soon after being elected, turns himself into president for life. Then a few years later, his nephew enacts a coup d'etat, takes over, that's Obiang Masoga. And Obiang is still currently, from 1979 to the present, still the dictator, and he's the longest serving dictator on the continent of Africa. And they are of this place, they are of the kind of continental ethnic group, the Fang, specifically the Mongomo clan. And they actually rule Equatorial Guinea with an iron fist, and have taken over the majority of this island. And so what we can think about is the kind of overlapping ways, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, is that when we're thinking about Equatorial Guinea, we're not thinking about just one ethnic group. We're thinking about multiple ethnic groups, multiple people. Folks in Corisco and Ndowe, and Anabon, they're Anabones, right? They have even a different lingua franca, Fala Gramo, which is kind of an Anabones language. that is a Portuguese Creole because they were originally colonized by Portugal. You can see how close they are to Sao Tome and Principe, right? And so one of the important things for me that has been exciting in this project is tracing the legacies of colonization as well as the legacies of resistance to that colonization. So one important thing, I'll go back to this map really quickly, that was really startling to me was that when Spain loses the Spanish-American War and loses Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, basically loses all of its final Caribbean and Pacific islands, colonies, it turns back to Equatorial Guinea, basically a colony that it had abandoned, and recolonizes Equatorial Guinea in 1898. So in that year, they signed 2 treaties of Paris, right? One Treaty of Paris here, one Treaty of Paris there, and then they decide to consolidate all of these islands. They kind of, because there's so many different kind of colonial forces in this area, they signed a treaty so that they can consolidate these islands and then recolonize Equatorial Guinea until 1968. So we can see a direct connection, right, to that. Not only that, but what we know is that in the 19th century, we have anti-colonial agitators from Cuba, from Puerto Rico, and from the Philippines, which is not on this map, being kidnapped by the Spanish in the middle of the night and deported to Fernando Po, to penal colonies in Fernando Po. What's more than that, also in the late 19th century, we have Cuban emancipated slaves, emancipados, promptly upon being emancipated, being deported to Fernando Po, to Bioko, right? So in Bioko, and you go to this kind of opening image of the book, there's a kind of dedication, a mural to the emancipated Cuban slaves who were deported to Bioko. You know, I got into this project by thinking through the questions of language, and folks in Equatorial Guinea linguists were like, how come they have these Caribbean accents, like these Spanish Caribbean accents in Equatorial Guinea? And it's because of these long legacies of crossing, right? These long legacies of imperial, colonial, and violent crossings. Called New York Nonstop Metropolis, which is a book of different kind of cartographies of New York City. There's like a map that is like a map of the New York subway station that has every stop is where like a famous woman has lived, right? So you could be like, this is where Audre Lorde lived, and this is where so-and-so lived, right? And so this map in that book is called Of Islands and Other Mothers. And this is a map of the Caribbean islands put together with the islands of New York City, right? Kind of bringing to bear and making us see what Latinx studies has long said, which is that New York, Chicago, Miami, and points beyond are extensions of the Caribbean, right? They're extensions of this place by nature of the large amounts of migration and folks that are there. And so I thought this was a really exciting and important map to include because I wanted us to kind of think of other cartographies and other ways that we can think about, right? Human geography, right? Beyond the kind of maps that we are given. In addition to this, I'm thinking through the kinds of prompting that decolonial feminisms, women of color and Black feminist thought have offered me in my journey as a thinker. And for me, it has been a guiding kind of source, both thinking through decolonial feminisms and women of color feminisms, and I'll talk a little bit about these. So I'll just give 2 small pieces of decolonial feminisms. And here, and part of this accepted from my book, is that decolonial feminisms have sought to think through and beyond the ways that colonial hierarchies of the human seek to, quote, fragment peoples categorically, and instead to find ways to engage with indifference and to find what Maria Lugones calls possible companions in resistance. What would it mean for us to find companions in resistance, right? Both intellectually, practically, like materially, right? And so I'm thinking in the text both like, can Equatorial Guinea, can the Latinx Caribbean be companions in resistance? How do we imagine that? How does that work, right? But also, through our work, what are the companions that we make intellectually of resistance, right? Who are we citing and who are we bringing together to make clearer a picture that we want to render visible? Laura Perez argues that a decolonizing politics must introduce, engage, and circulate previously unseen, marginalized, and stigmatized notions of spirituality, philosophy, gender, sexuality, art, or any other category of knowledge and existence. And for me, that has been so important, right? That has been a guiding light to think about what needs to be brought out, right? How do I listen to these texts? How do I engage them? Not just with the question that I want to bring to them, but when I read the text, what are they telling me, right? And how they push me beyond even my own limits of thinking, right? And even in uncomfortable ways. I'm also thinking about the question of relationality, and I'm thinking about it both within the kind of Caribbean context, so obviously Glissant, right, the Creolite, and all these folks who are thinking through questions of relationality, the abyss, right, thinking through the rhizome in all of these ways, But I'm so indebted to women of color feminists. And when I'm talking about women of color feminists, I'm not talking about the kind of watered down versions that we get like on Instagram and TikTok or wherever else, right? Like I'm talking about the like radical political project of like Black, Indigenous, Latina, right? Like Asian women coming together in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s and putting like their differences not aside, but to the center and trying to figure out each other's lives, histories, and how they can create coalitions across differences, right? So think about this radical political project that is likewise an intellectual project. For me, it has been important to kind of build through relationality, not just the kind of philosophical canon that we have been offered by, Caribbean thinkers who we know, but also to these women of color thinkers and poets and activists who were able to balance both what it looks like on the page and then also putting together conferences and gatherings and making space for that to happen in real life, right? So Audre Lorde tells us that the future of our earth may depend upon the ability of all women to identify and develop new definitions of power and new patterns of relating across difference. We have no patterns for relating across our human differences as equals. And because of this, we stand to be fractured from one another and ourselves, right? And so I think about this, how do we find companions in resistance if we're continually fractured from ourselves and from the others, right? And then this is an important one. The project of relations is a lifetime pursuit, one that women of color feminists have kept alive as a politics and as a praxis. It is a methodology of complex coalition building, of learning each other's histories, of understanding why differences fragment communities in search of liberation. And here's a quote from Chandra Mohanty that says, "It is not color or sex that constructs the grounds for these struggles. Rather, it is the way we think about race, class, gender, and the political links we choose to make among and between struggles," right? This is so important, but I also love that it is noted that this is a lifetime pursuit. Both Audre Lorde and Jackie Alexander say, this is really hard work, right? Like, this is very hard work. It's not easy to engage with someone whose differences are so much greater than yours, right? But also who you have learned to think about in ways that are very much in line with larger lies, stereotypes, right? Like the kinds of lies we're told to believe about each other, right? And so for me, this has been important to be real about. Like relationality is all well and good, but we have to know that it is like something that is so difficult to put into practice. And because of that, it's so important both to think about it and to act on it. Okay, so I'm thinking about relationality. You saw this map with these two different places. I've talked about the way that in Equatorial Guinea, we have multiple ethnic groups, multiple languages. Spanish is the lingua franca in the majority of Equatorial Guinea, but everyone is speaking their indigenous languages as well. And then we also have these like inter-ethnic hierarchies, right, and struggles that need to be paid attention to. On the other side of the Atlantic, when we're thinking about Latinx studies, we know that we are contending with the violent legacy of mestizaje, right? With the ways that this kind of ideology of racial democracy has marred our worlds in many ways, right? This idea that, your race doesn't matter because we're all Cuban or we're all Puerto Rican or we're all this. At the same time that you can utter, well, she's black but beautiful, or, every sheep with its pear, cada oveja con su pareja, right? Or you can say, todos somos café con leche, uno más café, otro más leche, you know what I mean? But we also know that when we go to the media, the only people that you see are the people with más leche, right? If you're más café, you are not on screen, you are hypersexualized or invisibilized, or you're created into this kind of like servant or mammy figure. So there's all these ways that we're like being gaslit by mestizaje. And when we think about what that means in the diaspora is that we move across, right? We move across space into another geographic zone where the reigning ideology for race is a different one, right? Hypodescent, the one-drop rule. And at its face, it seems like these are very different ways to think about race, right? Like we can go into debates about sociologists and how they understand it and how, people think that their idea of race is the right one and the other person is the wrong one. I think they're both really messed up, right? We all know that they're both really messed up. But for me, what has been important is to note that both mestizaje and hypodescent are both anti-Black and anti-Indigenous at their core, right? One seeks to move people towards whiteness. You have to mejorar la raza, right? You have to better the race by a vigorous mixing, right? And then on the other one, you have to protect whiteness at all costs, right? One drop of impurity makes you impure, right? I think the kind of case that comes to mind is in Michael Omi's book when he talks about the Suzy Giroy Phipps case in Louisiana when she finds out that she's considered a Negro and she's like 1/28th Black, right? And she tries to change it in the courts and they're like, no, you're a Negro, you know? And she's like, oh no, it can't be, right? And so we can think about the ways that these laws, right, are created to protect whiteness and to systematically disenfranchise Black people and indigenous peoples, right? So in that way, for me, I've been interested in how do we contend with those clashing yet equally anti-Black and anti-indigenous ideologies when we're talking about Afro-Latinx folks. When you're coming from a place where people say, your race doesn't matter, but your hair is bad, right? And then you step out and you're like, okay, so, you know, my race doesn't matter. And then they're like, hey, Black girl, right? And so this is the kind of things that are coming up in the text and how they're contending with it. So for me, I was thinking, when I was putting this project together, it's like I could do a really simple comparison between Equatorial Guinea and the Caribbean, but that would be really messed up because there's no way that I could reduce these experiences to one another. I can't just say they're all Black, and because of that, there's this thing. So I had to come up with a way to hold for these differences, right? And so this is the critical cartography of racialization, which helps us to think, and helps us to hold space for the different ways that anti-Blackness and the colonial difference imbue former colonies and contemporary metropoles. This relational cartography of racialization for Afro-diasporic peoples outlines the unfixed, racial, ethnic, ontological, and phenomenological experiences that emerge moving across spatial and temporal locales. And I'm thinking here also about the folks in Equatorial Guinea, right? Where in a place where you can't necessarily move from one city to another city without a pass, right? With this like paramilitary police everywhere, and there's a very clear understanding of like ethnic hierarchies and permissions, right? Even on land that is your own land, right? How those things seem to disappear once they go into Spain, where they're like, you're all Black. You know, we don't care about your little infighting. We don't care about your little hierarchies, right? And so that forges a different kind of relationship in exile and diaspora for Ecuadorianos, right? And so for me, it has been really important to say like, well, this is what's happening here, but then when they move here, this is what's happening here, right? Like, and so for me, it's a way to kind of hold space for the different ways that movement through space and through time change your subjective experiences, right? And so oftentimes you have to hold on to multiple experiences, not just one way to think about yourself in the world. You have to experience multiple. Okay. So as I'm thinking about this, I'm going to kind of, with that kind of framework in mind, I'll move through a little bit more of the book. So the beginning of the book is relations, and so this is kind of what we talked about. I talk about the maps, I talk about relationality, the archipelagos, the colonial feminisms, you know, critical cartography of racialization, et cetera, et cetera. I move on to the opening chapter of the book, Intimacies. And in that chapter, I'm tracing the ways that both occupation and dictatorship are such violent intrusions into the intimate lives of peoples under their heel, specifically Black women and girls, right? I'm looking at the way that, for example, in Equatorial Guinea, in two different novels, both dictatorship and also forms of conscripted heterosexuality and homophobia that is both a legacy of colonialism, but is also indigenous, right? The kind of what Julieta Paredes calls the doble entronque, the double juncture of a colonial and an indigenous patriarchy, come together to limit the lives of lesbians, gay, and trans individuals. So I read the first LGBTQ novel coming out of Equatorial Guinea by Trifonia Melibea Obono called La Bastarda. It is also translated to English, the first woman author from Equatorial Guinea to be translated to English. And the novel is also called La Bastarda in that series. And I also read a novel by Juan Tomás Ávila Laurel, who is from that little island that I showed you that's all the way cast, you know, to the bottom. And in those two novels, I track the way, for example, that dictatorship and the kind of decisions made by the dictator are able to impact, like, the folks in Annabon, what they can eat, what they can wear, whether they have soap, kerosene, right? When they sign a lease to lease the, quote unquote, the seas out to these larger European nations, then the fishers, right, who are subsistence, you know, fishers, are not able to fish. What we see is the kind of creation of an exploitative economy with women at the center of those who are being exploited. We also see the kind of decimation of the island's population through this kind of bout of cholera, right? With absolute neglect from the kind of seat of power. On the other side, I'm looking at the ways, look at a novel from the Dominican Republic called Song of the Water Saints. And in that novel, I look at the ways that US occupation in the Dominican Republic circumscribes the lives of Black peasant girls, women and girls, how these kinds of what Achille Mbembe would call private indirect government are able to go into people's homes, take their food, contaminate their water, rape these women and basically torture them with no consequences. However, I'm actually interested in the forms of resistance that emerge from this. So in each of these novels, these women and girls enact a form of radical freedom, both embodied through kind of erotic desire, right? Through what Nadia Salas Salgado calls la conciencia corporal, or corporeal consciousness, comes to bear, and they move beyond the limits and the confines of what is both dictated by the state and even by their local communities and families, right? We see that happening in the novel from the Dominican Republic across multiple generations. In the novel La Bastarda, we see a kind of creation of a commune, of a community outside of the kind of limits of the society in the forest that actually like replicates so much of the oral histories of how that first community came to be, right? And then in the Dictador de Corisco, in the Al del Monte de Noche, about Annabon, we see this move we see this kind of violent excess that happens as a result of this isolation with this woman who attempts to have some kind of freedom, right? Being the victim of this crowd violence, and then a series of changes that emerges after that, right? But it is a kind of way for me to think about what Jessica Marie Johnson calls Black femme freedom in the face of all of these forms of violence. And so for me, I opened the book up with the question of intimacies because there's so many different kinds of things happening in each one of these novels. And I wanted to pose a question like, if all of these things are happening, if all of this is popping off in this literature, right? Who is seeing this? Like, are we reading these books for this? Are we reading them at all? Are we reading them for pleasure, right? For the aesthetic purposes? Or are we reading them to be instructed in terms of like how we can think differently about our positions and our forms of resistance and other people's positions and forms of resistance, right? In relation to our own. And so I move from there to the chapter Witnessing, where the question is, who sees this, right? And what is the role of the writer, of the reader, of the thinker in terms of witnessing? And so it follows a very long kind of philosophical thread that begins with like Heidegger's master-slave dialectic and the kind of feminist philosophers talking about witnessing beyond recognition, and then moves on to thinking about the way that decolonial feminists have thought about faithful witnessing as both a philosophical concept but also a practice. And for me, and in terms of reading about faithful witnessing, it is something that I have seen practice my whole life, right, by the women in my communities and my family. So I consider faithful witnessing as a practice that has been in existence since time immemorial, particularly for women who have been, right, at the forefront of these particular kinds of struggles of dispossession and violence, right? And so faithful witnessing is not just an act of seeing, right, but the second step is actually stepping in the fray on behalf of someone else to believe, even if you have not seen, right, and to act, right? And so for me, I like that idea of thinking about witnessing, and I was interested in the ways that the books that I take up in that chapter witnessed both a kind of the religious colonization of Equatorial Guinea on the one hand, and then the kind of endemic forms of like femicide and violence against women on the other, right? I wanted to kind of sit with the ways that they are offering us ways to think through things that we might be so desensitized to because they happen all of the time, right? In particular, I was thinking about both in the case of Donatan Ndongo's Las Tinieblas de tu Memoria Negra, Shadows of Your Black Memory, and The Brief Life of Oscar Wilde, and thinking through the questions of like Junot Diaz and questions of misogyny, questions of violence, and the questions of like, what happens when the text itself reveals violence and the author himself is also implicated in that violence. And so for me, it was an important thing to kind of tease out and to be very direct about how and why, right, we are engaging these texts. And so I have like a whole section in that chapter. I move on from witnessing to think about like, if witnessing is so important, and for me, witnessing is probably one of the most important parts of the project of decolonization, right? Because in order to see resistance, you must see power, right? You must see the structures, you must see the violence in order to resist them and to add your own body into the fight against resistance, whether it's happening to you or others. So if witnessing is so important, for me, the next chapter was thinking about, well, what's the first thing we should be bearing witness to? And for me, it's this question of destierro. And destierro is a kind of untranslatable word in Spanish for exile. So exile in Spanish is exilio. Destierro is another word for exile. But it means to be forcefully torn from the earth, right? It means to be like ripped up off the earth. And for me, there was a few ways to think about this. But one of them was that in decolonial thought, there's not much work that exists around questions of diaspora. and questions that deal with the kinds of nitty-gritty of like diaspora, exile, dispossession. What does it mean to be dispossessed onto someone else's land, right? All these kinds of questions. And for me, thinking about destierro as this important framework for thinking about diaspora in longer context, right? So what does it mean to think about capitalism as it forms in the long 16th century, right? And the ways that peoples are dispossessed from their lives, from their lands, and then put onto the lands of other people who have been similarly dispossessed, both from their lives and their lands, also from their languages, from their practices, from their foods, right, from their cultures, fighting all they can to retain what they can in these practices. For me, it's important to think about destierro as this overlapping form of dispossession, right? And for me, destierro, it has been very clear that it's not enough to recognize and see one's own destierro, right? Like, okay, I could say like, my family has this long history and we are, descendants of enslaved Africans and we are colonial subjects and now we're here, right? Like now we're here in the United States. But what does that look like when I put that in relationship to the African American experience here, the indigenous experience here, the experience of, the Asian diaspora here, right? Like when you start to think about this in much more complex ways, then you begin to see a palimpsest of dispossession, right? You begin to see the ways that we both have struggled together and also have sold each other out, right? And so for me, destierro is not just those violent acts, but also how we have fought and made claims against those acts, right? Constant demands for reparations, right? Constant clinging to spiritual practices, to our foods, to our languages, right? These forms of reclamation and survivance that have become important. And so the question in terms of thinking about destierro is, how can we use this idea of destierro to think about what our futures can look like, right? If the descendants of Afro and indigenous people are subject to these conditions, what would it look like for us to imagine reparations, right? And what does the future look like? So the next chapter of reparations thinks about reparations both within material terms, but most importantly outside of material terms, right? I'm taking the material, money, whatever, as a given, and saying, okay, if they gave us money, then what, right? Like if they gave us land, then what? If they are able to kind of calculate the harms done, the intergenerational harms done to a dollar amount, would that be a bomb for us, right? And I just don't think it would be, right? I think we have to contend with the kind of ways that we have been fractured from ourselves and from others. I think that in this chapter, I traced a series of novels that think about reparations in different ways, from Puerto Rico, from the Indowe experience, and from the Dominican experience, and think about reparations both in terms of battles and blood and resurgence of different generations. Another novel talks about reparations as like, we're gonna buy the block and we're gonna be the block and we're gonna like give the block back to the people, and then that kind of fails, right? Because it is like modeling your future in the same kind of capitalist practice that's not really fit for us, right? But then we have a move to think about questions of like language, of relationality, and of imagining differently. And so in this chapter, I'm thinking, and I talk about some real life experiences across both thinking about the incommensurability oftentimes of Black and Indigenous conversations around reparations, which really helped me even remap this book and this chapter. But I think about here the reparation of the imagination, which is exactly what each one of the books is asking us to do. To repair our imagination, to think differently about what reparations would look like. Why would we have to imagine reparations through the kind of structures of like World War II or whatever, right? Like through this kind of modern structure. What would reparations look like for us? And actually, what would reparations look like between us? So by the time we get the material reparations that we are continually demanding, we would have a different vision of what that would look like outside of, right? The kind of structures that would have us radically individualize what those reparations could look like. And I think those books helped me get to that because I wasn't ready for that, And then I kind of end with thinking about the kind of reparations of the imagination as a kind of way to imagine futures. And so for me, the last chapter, Apocalypso, was one to consider how do Afro-Hispanophone and Afro-Latinx folks think about futurities? Can we think about it through the lens of Afrofuturism, right? Is it something else? And so what I decided was that I wasn't necessarily gonna call it Afrofuturism. I didn't wanna kind of pigeonhole them into a genre, particularly the folks from Equatorial Guinea who I see the work as like really working in that genre. But when I talked to them about it, they were kind of like, I'd never heard of it. So I was like, there's a way that I could as a critic be like, yeah, that's what it is, but it doesn't seem ethical, right? But I was thinking about the ways that they were conceiving of futurities. And in that chapter, I traced two different forms of future work, right, where these folks are imagining what I call worlds otherwise. One is thinking through Santeria and Lukumi, thinking about the ways that Afro-Latinx folks engage in this ritual practice and this memorial work, tracing ritual songs from the 19th century and the present, as well as videos and images, contemporary videos and images, and the Mayuba, as well as a series of ritual songs, to think about the ways that they subvert the logics of temporality and spatiality, right, of modern coloniality, because of the ways that they insist that Black ancestors are important, they are loved, they are valuable, their lives matter, not only in the past, but in the present, but not only in the present, but literally for the future, like you need them to guide you forward, and that there is no future without them, right? And so for me, that was a beautiful way to imagine what futurities look like and have always looked like within these Afro-Latinx contexts, right? I then look at the other side, right? So novels from Equatorial Guinea, one from the Dominican, and a short story from the Dominican Republic, that talk about this apocalypse, right? The end of worlds, the dying of the seas, the kind of environmental crisis, right, that is like upon us, and the after effects of that in terms of thinking about both the memory of a people, right, the ability of people to stay alive throughout this kind of turmoil, as well as the kind of boomerang effect, right, of colonialism, right? Like this destruction is coming back, right, to Europe. This destruction is coming back, right, to the quote unquote first world. And so there's this way that these works are likewise a parable, right, to think about exploitation, capitalism, and greed in really important ways. And I build in this chapter thinking about apocalypso through the work of Michelle Cliff. In her book, If I Could Write This in Fire, she has a chapter called In My Heart a Darkness, where she writes about the limit of the white imagination, right? She says that they can't imagine Black people outside of whoever they've imagined we are, right? And she talks about this moment of misrecognition because she's a light-skinned, kind of white-passing Jamaican woman, right? And then the moment where they reveal, they say something racist, right, to her about Black people, and then she's like, haha, I'm Black, right? And then they're like, oh no. And she says, you know, there's this moment in which she becomes the physical manifestation of the impossibilities that they've imagined. Like they can't imagine enslavement. They can't imagine, you know, miscegenation, right? Like they can't imagine these kind of violences that would bring her into being in front of them. And so she says in that chapter, when the other appears to be the one, apocalypso, right? You've ended their imagination. You've ended their world, right? And so for me, the question of apocalypso and questions of futurity is like, what happens when we end the world of colonialism, when we decide to like blight the white imagination and continue our practices and imagine futures in a different way, right? And we continue our thing without worrying about what their ideas of temporality and spatiality are, without these other kinds of intellectual, mental, and emotional impositions, right? And so Michelle Cliff helped me get there. I end the chapter, I end the entire book with the question, with a kind of meditation on the sea. The sea comes up in every single one of the chapters, but ain't nobody got time for that, right? I couldn't like sneak it in. So I wanted to end with the sea. And in that chapter, I look at poetry by Raquel y Lombe del Pozo de Pita from Equatorial Guinea, as well as Aracelis Girmay, who is an Eritrean and Puerto Rican and African American poet. And then I also analyzed this image by Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, which is called De las Dos Aguas, of the two waters, right? And for me, this chapter really brings together and shows how the poetry of these three Black women, right, are able to touch every single theme, every single preoccupation, right, that has emerged through the series of these other like 16 texts, right? The image by Maria Magdalena Campos Pons is likewise to me a different kind of map. A different map, unlike the kind of opening cartographies of the book that give us like, this is what things look like, right? For this image, what we see is Maria and herself, right? Two images of herself covered in locks. We see her holding a canoe with four figures that could be men or orishas, right? We could think about the two waters as being the crossing of the Atlantic. We can also think about this in the kind of question of Lukumi, of herself being of De las Dos Aguas, a daughter of both Yemaya and Oshun, right? We can also kind of see these kind of bags that are being tied. They're tied to her hair, and they're in her hands and also falling below the ship like anchors. And these little paper bags have little circles, and the little circles say, this is not art, right? And so to think about these like long histories of crossings, about the dead beneath the sea, they are not art, right? They are us, they are our ancestors, and we have to begin to think differently about how we connect and relate across las dos aguas, right? And I think there's many ways and many readings of this text, of this image. And for me, it is just something that continues to give possibilities. I'll end with this, which is, for me, one of the key parts of this book was thinking through and about decolonial love as an action. And what propelled me to finish this book and to write this book was being indebted so much to the work of these writers that helped me to imagine and to think in different ways. And so throughout the book, I build on this definition of decolonial love. And here's two of them. So decolonial love as future work envisaged through our past is necessarily a technology for social transformation. And that little quote comes from Chela Sandoval's Methodology of the Oppressed. And it's a method through which we can reimagine human being as praxis. Again, thinking about the work of Sylvia Wynter, which is actually the opening epigraph of my book. Decolonial love manifests as attention to 1492, to the past before it, the past since, the subterranean roots created by it, and the dead beneath the sea. It can be imagined as looking into the vast and inconsolable sea to make visible what was disappeared and make perceptible futurities beyond colonization. And so that, I think, is it. Thank you.
What a wonderful introduction to the book. It just like whetted my appetite to actually dig in and read each chapter closely. And also just as someone, it reveals my own, and the fields in which, say, African studies, literary studies, Black diasporic literary studies, of especially contemporary literature, the emphasis on the Anglophone African world, right? And what the kind of the periphery of the margin can teach us about the present kind of African literary production, but also how to connect or remap the Atlantic world. So I was incredibly taken by that. I guess the question I have for you is maybe a generational question, right? So, you know, African literature is in vogue in ways maybe it hasn't been since the 60s. When you think about the generation like Chimamanda, Mario, Jasi, we can name them, right? And so you have that. And I'm curious just how you think about your own, you know, from the examples that you've given us, especially Equatorial Guinea, like how to map that trajectory for you. Right? So we know how to map it from in the Anglophone thing.
Yeah.
You get the Ngugi and whatever, the Achebe debates.
And Ngugi's, you know, the whole thing, yeah.
Exactly. Just like how generationally or how they graft themselves onto the kind of African tradition. And again, these are just
No. It's such a good question. No, it's such a good question. And, you know, I will say that how I got into the learning about Equatorial Guinea was through the old school African literature, like literally like reading, you know, Achebe and Senghor, and then reading about the debates. Like I was reading Emmanuel Eze's On Reason, the kind of his last book before he passed away, right? This beautiful tome of philosophy. And then in chapter 4 of that, I think it's like Languages in Post-Colonial Memory, he's like, this is what African literature does, and it undercuts European ideas of ahistoristic, and I was like, yes, right? Like, this is amazing. And then he starts talking about Ngugi, and he's like, and then there was this beef. And I went to the old issues of transition in the polemic session, and I was like, oh my God, the 1960s, 70s, and 80s tea, right? Like, this is amazing. And that is what got me into this project, because then from there, someone was like, oh, you really like that? Did you know that there's a literature in Africa that's Spanish, right? And when I was reading the books, and the first one I read was Las Ciruelas de tu Memoria Negra, I realized that like this is like an anti-colonial like testament, like many in the Anglophone world, right? Like it reminded me of like Memi and like Achebe, like it reminded me of all these folks. Like I'm like, okay, this is a theme, this is a genre, right? Where they're like bearing witness to what's happening, and they're like, let me show you what's really going on, right? And with the kind of fierce anti-colonial critique. However, because it's in Spanish, folks are not necessarily reading it, and they're not considered part of the African canon of literature. So they're very much excised from that. Not only that, but also because these literatures are mostly banned in Equatorial Guinea. So Equatorial Guinea has one bookstore. It's on the island of Malabo. And I've been there, and it's wall to wall. Like there's some children's books, but mostly biographies of the dictator. The majority of the work is published in Spain, right? It's not published there, and it's you know, even there was a comic recently, Ramon Ebono, who was in exile, and he went to kind of renew his paperwork, and he was kidnapped and tortured for months before he was released back to Guatemala, right? And all because he wrote a graphic novel that's called Las Pesadillas de Obi, basically Obi's nightmares. And the premise of it is like, what is Obiang, the dictator's nightmare? His nightmare in the book is to wake up and to be just like any other Equatorial Guinean, like scarcity of water, scarcity of food, right? Like all this, and they were like, we're gonna torture you, right? Like, so you can imagine, like, so that actually like makes it difficult for the work to circulate, but they're also surrounded by like Francophone and Lusophone nations, right? So like, and Anglophone nations. So that the work doesn't necessarily circulate that way, but they are reading the work of other folks from the continent and from beyond. And in the very preface of the book, I talk about the way that Carlos Otón, a poet from Equatorial Guinea, writes a poem in Ode to Nicolás Guillén in Cuba, right? So he's like, oh, like, oye mis versos, mi ritmo, right? Guillén, right? Like, nativos del África Madre, allá de viaje en las Antillas, right? Like, you are African natives on a voyage in the Antilles, right? Like, but there's this kind of connection to other Spanish-speaking Black people, right? Where they see a connection. And so language becomes really important. And even in that chapter, like, Apocalypso, I talk about, like, one of the reasons that I'm hesitant to be like, this is Afrofuturism, for the reasons I already said, but also because so much of Afrofuturism is not just US-centered, because it's not, because there's so much beautiful African work in English that is about Afrofuturities, but it is Anglophone-centric, right? And so for me, it's a question of like, how can we expand the kind of conversation and listen to folks who have endured colonialism? I mean, Equatorial Guinea endured colonialism until 1968, right? Like, they're like deep in it. And then after that, like successive dictatorships. And also, one thing that I didn't mention is that they're really rich. They're a very wealthy nation because in the 1990s, they found offshore oil reserves, right? And so they're probably they are often in competition for first or second most wealthy nation. But that doesn't trickle down, right? So there's all of these things that become really important. And then also there's like the geopolitical stuff. Sorry, I'm nerd out. But the other thing is like, so they're lingua franca and Spanish, but then the Obiang regime, because they're so isolated, one of the things that they have started to do is just make French and Portuguese and whatever else they can find as their official languages so that they can be let into the kind of unions, right, into the different like unions of nations that have those languages in order to have a recognition because of their fierce human rights violations, right? Like, so they're trying to find ways to kind of step in, but literature is not one of them. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, it's shady. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first, amazing presentation. I did my undergrad thesis on this actually, similar to this. How just a lot of like the cultura that we have now is based on African culture and like the lula, the Indian, the holy, so amazing. I guess my first question would be, where do you think, in terms of education, this would be going in, let's say, Latin America, in providing more, I guess, awareness and, like you said, literature and just knowledge about the African diaspora and, you know, where the practices came from, where like the culture in general, because it's a mixture of Spanish, African, and indigenous, depending on the location. So I guess where would you say this is going in terms of educating people in Latin America?
Yeah, I mean, I think people in Latin America are educating themselves. There's such fierce, like, Black organizers throughout Latin America, and I'm thinking like Colombia, Brazil, even Argentina, which is like whitey, white, right? Like, what we do have is like these forms. I was just I'm gonna go here, sorry, this is my neck. This is a PowerPoint of like 1,000 slides. But I was just at this Black Women's Intellectual Contributions to the Americas right before COVID, and it was women from all over Latin America and the Caribbean, in speaking like Portuguese, Spanish, and English. I don't think we had many people speaking French there. And it was an incredible meeting of folks to talk about the kinds of activist work, educational work, community work, as well as like questions around land and organizing. So Tiana Paschal has a really great book. It's called Becoming Black Political Subjects, about the fight for the land grab in Colombia and Brazil. And I mean, and there's so much scholarship in the area. So I don't necessarily think it's about us thinking about how educate, like how we move education that way, but also learning about what's already being done in those places. Like Brazil is the nation state with the largest population of Black people outside of the continent of Africa. What can we learn when we think about the struggles of Black people and the way that they have organized and Black women have organized theirs? And the other question is the question of language. So much of that work, Marielle Franco, and some of these other women, Zuley Carneiro, who's here in the photo, their work doesn't necessarily circulate. Zuley Carneiro doesn't really circulate here because it's written in Portuguese. And so there's this huge move to get their work. And actually Kristen Smith here, who's at UT Austin, is working on translating so many of these like Brazilian Black women's work, because I think it's instructive both ways, right? So I think it's important for us to like recognize what's already happening in these places. And for example, my work in Puerto Rico is really engaging with the way that Black feminists there are moving and thinking about it. And honestly, like even move and think about it in different ways that even I do, right? So like part of it is like humbling yourself and getting into the situation and being like, okay, like how can I aid in how you're doing it? Because I would do it a whole other way, right? Like, but it's because, you know, for all different kinds of reasons, you know what I mean? So that's, I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that, they're translating Beatriz Nazimento's work. So that is what's coming up. And I think that's so important for us to be able to get that. And also for them, like, one of the things that happened here, and actually we did a podcast recording because I presented, I think Carol Boyce Davies presented, then I presented, then Bador Lagra presented, and we all talked about Sylvia Wynter. And then what we needed was like, but my presentation was in Spanish and Bador's was in English, and she had a paper only about Sylvia Wynter at that conference. And one of the exciting things that happened was that we had to translate on the spot because our sisters that were there from speaking Spanish and Portuguese were like, who are you talking about and what are you saying? And so, I was translating in Spanish and in Portuguese for them, and then we recorded a podcast about that moment where they're like, oh, that lady sounds really interesting, and then we were like, okay, this translation is really hard and we need to keep working at it because we're like learning so much from each other, but it would be so foreclosed, right? So that's one way that it happens even within our own hemisphere, right? And so like the work that I'm doing in Equatorial Guinea and the Latinx Caribbean is quote unquote easy. It's not, but it's easy because it's all in Spanish. It's Spanish and in English and Spanglish, and there's indigenous African words on one end, and I'm like in conversation like, what do those mean? I know what they mean on my side, right? Like that's one thing, but like imagine what would happen if we could relate across those linguistic divides, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
This is a little more in terms of semantics, but mentioning Afro-Latinx or Latinx in general, I guess what drove me to use that term, because coming from a generational perspective, like talking to my parents, Latinx is the term generally, it's not accepted, or like I'm Latina,
yeah.
Or I've heard Latin is another term. So what was your process on that?
I wish there was like a piece of chalk that I could like use in the board.
Oh, you see the corner there, it's like about very end level. You see my
Yeah, I got it. Okay. No problem. Okay. So yeah, so that's a really great question. And so I think it is generational. So we know that like we have after that, we have Spanish American, right? That's like the first. That's the first thing that we're given on the census, and then Hispanic comes into play after that. And then Latino comes into play in the 1960s and 70s when there's like bilingual education first comes into universities, and the students are coming to consciousness, and they're the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and all these folks, and they're like, we're learning about ourselves, and we're not Hispanic, we're nobody's panic, right? Like all that stuff, right? And also, this also privileges Europe, and it completely erases our indigenous and African past and our like ancestry. So they're like, we're Latinos, and that rides for a long time. And then they're like, that's gendered, so it has to be like Latina, right? And then when I was coming up in undergrad, it was like that, and then it was also the Daroba, so we're Latino, right? So now we're both of those together, and nobody's first, we're both there, right? Both quote unquote genders, sexist, right? And then what we see around like 2013, 2014 is the move to say like, actually like this is one that is looking at the kind of gendered, like Spanish is a gendered language, but it's not really thinking about sex and things beyond the binary, right? It is also a time that is happening online, particularly on Twitter, with young Black activists, right? And so they're saying like, every time we use the tilde, we're like hyperlinking something, and like we're not, right? Like we want to end the sentence there, or we want to end the word there. So Latinx comes into play as a word that goes beyond the binary, also useful online. Then there's like all those debates, like, so in Puerto Rico and in Latin America, Latine, right, becomes a neutral, and it's actually colloquial, like people are using it. My book right now is being translated into Spanish, and I'm like working with a translator around questions of how do we make it inclusive. Now, language is always changing and evolving and transforming, and some people are like really stubborn about like, this is what I want and this is how I want it, and these young people are just like Shakespeare at clouds, right? Like, fine. I'm not someone who is like interested in taking away terms, phrases, or concepts that help people understand themselves better in the world, right? And so for me, I am very flexible, right? So if Latina, like I'm Latina, right? Like that is my identity. But if I'm thinking about the kind of broadness of Latino studies or Latinx studies, I'm happy to use that Latine, right? Like is an inclusive term, becomes so important, right? And so for me, it is always about being open to the kind of transformation of language, because if we stay static and saying like, no, I'm Latino or I'm Hispanic or whatever, like the world's gonna move beyond you, right? Like, and I actually do think we need to listen to young people.
I have, those are actually totally open questions. And one is considering what we call this black anti-colonialism that you were analyzing as well as in the Americas, as in Africa, in the case of specifically. But even though we have this black anti-colonialism that we can see together, okay, so in the as a group. So, did you find differences, particular differences between what you found? Even though I know you were trying to find the commonalities first, but the differences between those black anti-colonialism and black anti-colonialism in the Americas, in Spanish Americas, or Latinx Americas, and in Africa. And the second question is, I was really, it's great that term of apocalypse, I really love it. And, but my question is more related with the concept. So we were talking about how the Afro-Latinx communities, wherever we are, we have those other concepts of future. And so I was thinking that maybe concept of fusion for the Afro-Latinx people. And, but I would like to know more about that. So what are, because for me that apocalypso word was so appealing as an epistemological, so the epistemological possibilities that this concept could bring. And so, but more specifically in your work, so in your findings, in your book, how did you find these other concepts of future? If you can give us examples, because you were talking about how the, specifically the Yoruba religions were informing this other kind of future. So what are they?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Those are great questions. So for the first question, it was, what are the differences? Yeah, I think the differences for me were even as important as the kind of what we share. Particularly because each of the chapters, even though each has a theme, the works from Equatorial Guinea and from the Caribbean are very different in talking about each one of those themes. So one of the things that I realized early on is that, like, for example, I could have had a chapter on dictatorship and be like, Guinea has a dictatorship and the Dominican Republic had a dictatorship. This chapter is about dictatorship, you know what I mean? Like, and then everybody hated it, but instead, I was interested in how they approach the theme very differently. So when we're thinking about, for example, the question of reparations, as an example, the book from Equatorial Guinea was really thinking about colonial reparations and talking about guerrilla warfare, right? Like, and thinking about kind of Mamawati and also these other kind of spiritual systems that will allow them to regenerate through a battle, right? Through a physical battle of reparation for them was future generations, right? Which I tied then to thinking about, I'm forgetting the word of it, the word for kind of forced motherhood, like, right, to kind of, in indigenous studies, I was like tracing the kind of this long legacy of, you know, how can we distinguish this from pronatalism, right? And kind of conceiving of that versus what was happening on the other side in the question of reparation was like, reparation was literally like, in Bodega Dreams, right? And Esther Quiñones is writing, and I contended a lot with the way that he's writing Black characters too, right? And thinking about these folks, but he's writing about selling drugs to buy buildings, to give them to the Latino community, to the then, right? Like that's the repairs, reparations on our own terms, and a reparation that fails, right? So for example, those ideas of reparations in the book are they're not the same in any way, right? And the same thing goes for each chapter where, for me, one of the things that I did is like I approached the text and figured out like, well, this like witnessing seems to be a preoccupation. On the one hand, they're witnessing religious colonization and the kind of trying to instill what Ngugi calls the cultural bomb, right? So you see it in action. On the other hand, the other book is like in New Jersey, and you're seeing a transnational form of like of misogyny and violence against women, right? But both of them are bearing witness in important ways. And so for me, it was about seeing the very different approaches to a similar question or theme or preoccupation. So that's how I'm contending with the differences. And then for the question, and I think that makes actually the book a much richer reading rather than trying to find like one that talks about XYZ thing and the other one does the same thing and be like, oh, look, they're exactly the same, right? Like, and then the other question about Apocalypso, yeah. So Apocalypso, so the question of Michelle Cliff really helped me to think through this, particularly because I was thinking about, in the book I talk about a few different concepts. One is future work, right? So what is this future work that these Afro-Latinx and Afro-Hispanic folks are engaging through this particular writing or through their music or ritual practices? The other one was how they imagine worlds otherwise, right? These worlds/otherwise, to think differently from the kind of colonial imposition. And then the kind of larger framework was thinking about through Apocalypse. So what does it mean to turn away from, to end the world of the colony, right? The kind of constraints of the colony. And so in terms of thinking about this, like some of the work that I look at a young adult novel by this Cuban writer, Daniel Jose Older, Shadow Shaper, right? Where he's talking about this kind of intergenerational, it's kind of based on Lukumi, right? Like, but it's fiction. Thinking about the ways that they contend with the spirit world and are embodied by their ancestors, right? So like, not only do they are able to harness or see them and engage with them, but also harness their power, right? And it also talks about questions of gender and misogyny. But the second part, I'm looking at the work of Ibeyi, the sisters, the Afro-Caribbean French sisters who have their album, and I look both at their images and the music. And then also trace, like, for example, when they have these songs, and the album follows the Moyuba, right, like very kind of closely, and they have songs that evoke many of the Orishas. But beyond that, I was thinking about the kind of, what would it mean, and I connect this to both to Chano Pozo, to the kind of him, and then also to Malanga, so Jose Oviedo, who died, who was a Cuban rumbero. And so I basically am trying to link this long legacy of rumberos and santeros who have these odes and legacies to them that are still resonate today, even though, for example, Malanga, there's no images of him left, right? But if you hear like Unión de Reyes llora porque Malanga murió, you know, like it's something that 100 years later we're still singing, right? And that is still a popular song that reminds us of this man who was this black dancer and santero, who was this incredible figure, right? From Matanzas. And then I think about that in relationship to some folks like Ibeyi who have what I would say overrepresentation of images. We have lots of images of them, lots of videos where they're not just singing for a man, right? Like for a santero, but also singing for their sister, singing for, right? Like, so thinking about their ancestors in these multiple ways, and that practice is a long-standing practice, right? Of ritual song and remembrance of people who were not necessarily part of the archive, who would be forgotten, right? But that Santeria allows, and ritual practices allows for us to retain a memory of a people who would be arguably forgotten, ignored, not seen, their spirituality, their talents, right? completely erased from the record. And so for me, that is a way of engaging in a form of future work, a form of imagining a different world where Black people are not forgotten in the past, where their deaths are remembered, and not only remembered, but like lauded and sang to and praised as part of opening your path for the future, right? Which is what Santeria is about, opening those paths for you, right? And that you need those to bring you forward, right? And so for me, that part of the chapter of Apocalypso is literally taking seriously that practice and saying, like, what can we learn from this practice if we engage seriously with the knowledges that they hold on to and the memories that they hold on to? So for me, that is like the first part of that chapter, yeah.
So, YOMAIRA, as we end, and I think I speak for others, when I think about your future work, when I think about archival disappearances, I would love for us to end by just hearing a bit about that.
Yeah, I would love to. Should I share? Can I share something? Do you mind?
Of course.
I just presented this, but I can show you a little sneak peek of what it looks like. I'm hoping I'll finish it this year. But Archival Disappearances is a book that looks at the kind of lives of Black Puerto Ricans from the late 19th century to the present. It starts with looking at a late 19th century city called Vega Baja, which is where my father is from, and looking at I don't know why it doesn't want to come up. Oh, there. Looking at the archives, this is the Señora de Rosario, and thinking through questions of empire, archive stories, photographs, femicide, murder, arson, erasure, displacement, dispossession, and disappearance. So there's a lot going on. But that's basically the themes of what's going on in this book. And I'm basically looking at the lives of, I'm so sorry, I meant to do a warning about, there's a picture of a woman in a casket. So, of this woman, Catalina, and her 6 children in Vega Baja, Puerto Rico. And tracing her life in this place that is a Black city of Puerto Rico, a tobacco worker, someone who went to the United States, who was a victim of femicide in the United States, who left her children orphans, and tracing both her children. This is also a photo of Catalina. This is her daughter, Yeye. That's her son, Ismael, and his daughter, Zoraida. That is her son, Marcelino, and his daughter, YOMAIRA. That's me. And then her great-granddaughter, Vanessa, who's also in 1997 was murdered by her husband. And so thinking about this long legacy of femicide and thinking about how we can conceive of Black women's lives who are not necessarily found in the archive. So these are the women that are not found in the official records at the churches, whose death certificates, whose burial plots are not found, like Catalina, and thinking about that long legacy of her family and the multiple murders. 2 of her sons were murdered, right? And thinking through the kind of questions of death and who gets seen, and also thinking about the contemporary emergency that we have in Puerto Rico and in many other places around femicide. I then talk about displacement and fire and looking at arsons in Hoboken, New Jersey. So looking at this vis-a-vis, for example, the arsons in the Bronx that we know so much about. But Hoboken, New Jersey was 40% Puerto Rican, so it was the largest population per capita of any place in the United States of Puerto Ricans in one place. And during the 1980s and the early 1990s, there was a series of arsons that left many, many families dead in Hoboken. So tracing the archive and thinking about the ways that gentrification has created Hoboken now into a city that is like populated by very wealthy people, condos, and all these other places, but has erased the kind of lives of these Afro-descendants that lived there and that suffered through a horrific time in history. I then look at at the photography project, the Puerto Rican Diaspora Themes and the Survival of a People, which is by Frank Espada, which is a late 1970s, early 1980s photography project where he went across the United States to Puerto Rico, to Hawaii. He later even went to Guam and did like an interesting like archipelagic project, but that's beyond the scope of this. And I'm thinking through his photo documentary project and also the 140 oral interviews that he did of these folks. And I'm thinking about the ways that he documented Black Puerto Rican life. At the same time that I'm thinking about living Los Sures and the kind of Puerto Rican population of South Brooklyn, and thinking about this documentary that was made in 1984 about the survival of Black and Puerto Rican and Black Puerto Rican communities in Los Sures. And what's really interesting is that both here in this film, Delivered Vacant, which is a documentary about what happened in Hoboken, in that film I was able to find in one scene folks being paid off to leave their buildings, like to leave their homes. And I saw my aunt and her daughter walking in to get their payment to leave their burned down home, right? So it was a moment in which I recognized that like my family had sent me to go find things in the archive and I couldn't find it there, but then I'm like looking at these different projects and I find them there. When I'm watching Living Los Sures, I realized that this young man right here is my first cousin Danny, and he's on the cover of the film, right? And this is like kind of serendipity, like this is like random occurrences, right? And so I'm like, you know, I went all the way to the Archive of the Indies, the Ultramarine Archives in Spain, in Seville, to find my family, only to find them on a DVD in my living room, right? Like, and then the last part of the book is after the hurricane, where I went down to Puerto Rico. We got like a grant like 5 months after the hurricane with a team of other like African American, Chicano, and Puerto Rican like faculty and grad students with literally cash from the university to get filters and mosquito netting and do all these different things. And we interviewed about 32 Black women leaders. And so part of that chapter is really having them tell their own stories. We also dispatched one another to each other's families. Like at the very last day we were there. And so I was able to interview my aunt and her husband, and everybody was able to interview like one family member. But the majority of our trip was really kind of going into these Black communities, into the periphery of the Black communities, and figuring out how is that we can help. So for example, in this community, Minyi Minyi, they needed not only water, but the main need that they had after we talked to them at this like community meeting was that they needed diapers and bed, like cloths and care for encamados, for like bedridden elders. And so that was like our main goal, was like to go across the island and try to find as many supplies as we could for this one community, right? So like that kind of thing. So I'm not sure if this is still gonna be part of the book. I think it kind of goes, but I'm not sure. But that's basically it. And so the book itself has a series of other like public humanities projects attached to them, and public like digital archives. But that's basically what I'm working towards. And I think like part of it is interesting in that when I first went to graduate school, I went there to do a project on Puerto Rican literature and Puerto Rican people. And then I ended up with this project that was like transatlantic, you know, Equatorial Guinea. Like I was like in Africa doing stuff, and I was like, how did I get here? Like, how did I end up on this project? And then, you know, naturally and organically moved backwards to the second project that is very much centered in like a Black Puerto Rican life and trying to document it and prove. I mean, not only prove that it exists, because people, like Puerto Rico is quote unquote the whitest island in the Antilles, right? Like is the shade of it all, right? But also to show the love that Black people have for one another and the memories that they hold of each other. So for me, that's the kind of emphasis for that book. So I'm excited to be able to go back to that. So yeah, so thank you. Thank you.